Evening, everyone. It's good to be back. Natalie and I were happy to be back. It was a lot of socializing, which is good, but it was a lot of new people, and Layla was kind of not used to the socializing, so we're just happy to be home and have a house to ourselves. We're sharing a house with people for 2 weeks there, but it was really good to have that trip and see some familiar faces, and of course to see Natalie's family and stuff. We all really enjoyed that, and so. But it's always good to be home. We're going to be starting a class in Ecclesiastes, and since on Wednesday nights it's always obviously a smaller turnout, so we try to do it, or at least I try to do it in a quarter, because otherwise it rotates, and it's like I'm teaching a class, the last part of Ecclesiastes to people that weren't here for the first part. And so we're going to try and do it, chapter by chapter. We're going to try and get a chapter done every week. And we're just going to have to get a chapter done every week because that's just the way it is. So there's 12 chapters, and so I'm going to try and do the impossible and cover 12 chapters, one chapter every week. So we'll see how that goes. You guys know how good I am at covering a large chunk of Scripture in a succinct matter of time, but we'll do our best. Let's go ahead and start with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, thank you for this chance that we have to meet together, and we're thankful, God, for the beauty of this time of year and just the seasons and the reliability of the season are just a reminder that there's somebody in control, that there's really very little randomness that we see when we observe the creation. And it seems like things are set up and we're created and we're given order, and that just makes us mindful of you as our creator. And so we're thankful for everything that you've given us in this life, and for family and loved ones, and for this church. We thank you at this time for your word, and help us to understand it the best we can. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. And so we're definitely going to need God's help understanding Ecclesiastes because maybe no book is more confusing than the book of Ecclesiastes, because it's kind of a heavy book. And then on top of that, you have a variety of ways that you could translate several verses. And so we're often finding ourselves, asking, okay, what does this mean? What exactly is the author of Ecclesiastes trying to get at? And normally I would do an introduction here, but I want to kind of jump into the text, and then we'll do an introduction. I'm going to do it kind of backwards, but I think that's because that's how chapter 1 is written, that we kind of just jump into it, and then you get an introduction basically at verse 12. And so the first verse that we kind of look at that is one of the most memorable ones is verse 2. And it starts heavy. Vanity of vanities, says the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. The NIV goes even stronger. It says meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. CSB says absolute futility, says the teacher. Absolute futility. Everything is futile. Does anybody else's version say something different? That kind of covers most of them, I think. I think probably NASB says vanity of vanities. That's kind of that famous verse that we always think of whenever we think about the book of Ecclesiastes. And so when you start Ecclesiastes, you kind of start off depressed, because the very first words are everything is empty, everything is pointless, or so it seems. But I want to start off, and I want us to just kind of rethink this, because I kind of learned something that I hadn't known until I started studying and preparing to present this lesson to you. And so you might find that I present at least this first class in a way that maybe it's certainly different than what I had heard and how I had actually taught it in the past. But let's just look at what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew word that's translated vanities or meaningless is hebel. And so it literally says hebel, hebelim, says the teacher. Hebel, hebelim. Everything is hebel. And depending on what you understand this word to mean is going to impact really the next verses that follow it. But it's really also going to impact the way you read the rest of Ecclesiastes. And I think for the people who translate the book of Ecclesiastes, it impacts how they translate certain words. And you're going to see that even in chapter 1. And so if you go into the first passage that we're reading thinking that the author's intent is to say that everything is vain, everything is meaningless, that's going to impact how you translate things to follow. And so what does this word mean? when you look at those previous translations that I showed up there, meaningless, vanity, futile, those are actually interpretive translations. What I mean by that is that they took the word that is in the Hebrew, and the reason they translate it as vanity or meaninglessness is because to them, that's what this book is about. And so it kind of informed how they translate that word. When you look at the concrete meaning of the word, what the word actually means, it means vapor, breath, fog, mist. Did anybody know that? I didn't know that until I started studying. Show of hands, anybody know that that's what that means? You knew it because you're smarter than me. And well, it's true. That's not really saying much anyways. But this is even an ESV footnote here. It says, the Hebrew term hebel, translated vanity or vain, refers concretely to mist, vapor, or mere breath, and metaphorically to something that is fleeting or elusive with different nuances depending on the context. So that's the footnote in the ESV Bible that I have. So that's different than meaningless, isn't it? It's at least a little bit different. There's some flexibility in what this word means, and you have to look at the context to determine what it is the writer is trying to say. And so just kind of as a brainstorm exercise, what is the metaphorical value of mist, vapor, fog, or breath? And what I mean by that is, what are all kind of the lessons, the applications that when you look at fog, you can kind of apply to life? Or when you look at mist or vapor, you can kind of say, life is like a vapor and that da-da-da-da-da, right? What are some thoughts that you have as far as that goes? Transient. Okay. Yep, absolutely. Okay, yeah, that's James, right? It's there and then it's gone. What else? Anybody else? What about like fog? It's a little bit different than mist or breath, but I think that word has that, it can have that meaning as well. What about fog? Concealing. Yeah, so I used to wake up in Monroe growing up, and it was almost always during the summertime. You knew it was going to be a sunny day for some reason when it was misty out in the morning, when there was this heavy fog, and then it would burn off at noon. It's like, oh, it's foggy out this morning. I don't know why it worked that way, but it did. But you drive past the lake where that fog is rolling off, and you can only see, when it's real foggy out, what can you see? What's the only thing you can really see? You can see fog, and you can see what's immediately in front of you. And beyond that, you can't really see much else, right? And so it kind of covers things. And so you look at this word in Hebrew, which means, vapor, breath, fog, mist. It could have any of those meanings, really. And so when I think about this word, again, James 4 and verse 14 says, you don't know what life will bring, what your life will be, for you are like a vapor that appears for a little while and then it vanishes. It's interesting to me, it's James's point here to say that life is meaningless. Is that his point? That's fleeting. So he's using the word here in a different context. So the reason why when you read Ecclesiastes that almost all your translations will, this is a possible reason, that almost all your translations will read vanity or meaningless or something to that effect, is because the Septuagint translation came along several hundred years after Ecclesiastes was written, and they gave it a Greek word. When they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, they gave it a Greek word that does mean vain. But there was also other Greek translations that people were making that are ancient ones that were translated around the same time, and they used a different word, which means basically what the Hebrew word means, vapor, mist. And so then you have Jerome, he comes along and he makes, the King James Bible, right? Latin Vulgate, and he translated it into a Latin word which means vain. It was basically set in stone from there. And so this is kind of the word that it continued to be translated as is vain. And yet other translators, ancient translators, they were using the word that James uses here, which means vapor or mist. And so I just think that history is kind of interesting. Obviously, James isn't saying that life is meaningless in that context. He's saying that it's fleeting, that you're here and then you're gone. That doesn't mean that it's meaningless. It just means you're here for a short amount of time. And so we'll get back to that idea as far as what exactly that means. But let's go to verse 3. So verse 3 says, "What does a person gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun?" So I think when you look at this word vanity or hebel, I think that what's being said could be a variety of things. It could be that saying that life is like a vapor and that it's elusive. Life is like a vapor and that it's hard to get in our grasp. Life is like a fog and that it's kind of sometimes hard to understand. There's a lot of things that the more you look at them, the more confused that we get. I think philosophy almost, just listen to philosophers talk about time and you'll become very confused as you listen to them. And so it kind of brings about these questions that we look at life and we look at the temporary nature of life and how life seems to be constantly full of change. And we're left asking what I think might be the central question in the book of Ecclesiastes, which is, what does a person gain for all his efforts that he labors at under the sun? Because he notices what we all notice, that life is constantly changing, and he looks around and he's saying, okay, what do we get out of this? And so when you continue reading, he's kind of comparing our life, and there's a lot of ways to kind of interpret this, but I think what he's doing here in Ecclesiastes is he's comparing the human life, the human existence, to material existence, such as earth, such as, the four elements. That's really what he uses here. He uses the example of the earth, he uses the example of the sun, and he uses the example of the winds and the rivers. And he's comparing them and observing them and comparing how they work and how they're consistently doing what they do, and he's comparing that to man and kind of the ever-changing nature of man, I think. And so let's start in verse 4, and let's read this. It says, "A generation goes, and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever." You notice the contrast there. When he says a generation comes, a generation goes, you got this kind of constant coming and going of human beings, and yet he's saying the earth, in contrast to that, it remains forever. The sun rises and the sun sets. Panting, it returns to the place where it rises. Gusting to the south, turning to the north, turning goes the wind, and the wind returns in its cycles. All the streams flow to the sea, yet the sea is never full. To the place where the streams flow, there they flow again. All things are wearisome, more than anyone can say. The eye is not satisfied by seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. Can one say about anything, look, this is new? It has already existed in the ages before us. There's no remembrance of those who came before and of those who will come after. There will also be no remembrance by those who follow them. And so again, there's kind of two possible explanations for what the writer is doing here. He's either pointing at different things in life and saying, look how monotonous and boring life is. There's some people that interpret what he's saying in that way. And that could be what he's saying. But to me, when I look at this contrast, particularly in verse 4, it seems to me that he's comparing the human existence to that of these four elements that he uses as an example. And when we look at human beings, we find that we are transient. He says that a generation goes and a generation comes. I listened to a Jerry Seinfeld stand-up routine recently, and he was talking about this, how, every second, every day, there's babies being born, and at the same time, somebody's leaving. A generation comes, a generation goes. It's like, okay, bring in the next. You got to leave. Bring in the next. And basically, he says babies are cute until you realize that they are there to replace you. And he says that there are three words, the first three words that they speak are mama, dada, and bye-bye. That's life, right? People are born, people are leaving. And yet, when you look at the earth, he says, from our standpoint, our vantage point, he says it remains forever. Now, Solomon's not making a point about end times. He's not talking about when Jesus comes back or whether the earth will be destroyed. He's just simply saying, from a human standpoint, the earth exists a whole lot longer than we do. Every human being that has ever lived will experience the earth. They will experience the sun. They will experience the winds and the rivers. And yet, how many people will be familiar with your accomplishments? Will even know your name, right? There's rivers that have been around for multiple millennia, and they're still doing their thing. And so notice again, he says the earth remains forever. And so what I said before as well is that depending how you translate that word that's often translated vanity, it impacts how you translate other words. And so your version might say the sun rises and the sun sets, panting, it returns to the place where it rises, as if the sun is getting tired. But in other contexts, that word means longing, like longing for God's word. I think the ESV says the sun hastens to its place, that there's a sense of eagerness there. But there's this reliability with the sun, isn't there? There's stability when we talk about the sun. What can we count on when it comes to the sun tomorrow morning? What's it going to do? How do you know that? Yeah. There's no reason to think that it's going to do anything differently. And I think we take that for granted sometimes, because isn't that amazing that for thousands of years, the sun comes up, the sun goes down. The sun comes up, the sun goes down. The sun comes up, the sun goes down. Every day it rises and it returns to its place. There's a stability, there's a constancy when we're talking about the sun. Even the winds, where at first you might say, well, winds are kind of often metaphorical for inconsistency. They're kind of doing their own thing. But generally speaking, we know what the winds are going to do, don't we? They're going to blow to the north, or they're going to blow to the south. They're going to blow to the east, or they're going to blow to the west. In fact, here in Kansas, we basically have two winds for the most part. We got the wind coming from the north, and what happens when the wind comes from the north? It's cold. What happens when it comes from the south? It gets a little warmer for the most part, right? And so there's this reliability, this stability when it comes to the wind, generally speaking. In fact, he says the wind returns in its cycles, is what he says in verse 6. I think he's bringing out this stability that we witness and we see in nature. Then he talks about the streams. He says the streams flow to the sea, and yet the sea is never full. To the place where all the streams flow, there they flow again. And so it's interesting, these rivers and these streams have been running and running and running, some of them for thousands of years. And where do they all, for the most part, eventually end up? In the ocean, right? Or in a lake. And yet, how often do we see a worldwide flood occurring because these bodies of water just keep receiving endless supplies of waters, and it fills up, fills up, fills up until the earth is flooded, we all die? Does that happen? No. What happens? What happens to all that water? Where does it go? Yep, it recycles, right? It becomes a vapor. It goes up into the clouds. It rains, ends up on the mountains, in the form of snow, goes down the mountains, ends up in the river, and the whole thing goes on over and over and over again. Go ahead, Brian.
So how much new water has there been since the beginning of time?
I don't know. Somebody else want to answer that? My instinctual answer is none, but that's kind of a scary thought that we're all recycling each other's water. I don't know how I feel about that. But he's making the same point, though, that all that water, where it started flowing from, it eventually ends up there again. And so he says all things, again, a word, the word things there literally means word. It could mean that. It could mean word. So all words are wearisome, more than anyone can say. The eye is not satisfied by seeing, or the ear filled with hearing. But he goes on to say, and basically makes the point that you look at all these things. They go and they do their thing, and then they return to where they started from. But what about humans? What happens to humans? We go, we do our thing, and maybe from a micro standpoint, we're kind of like a river, and that we end up in the same place. So like Dan, he always says that he's just making the donuts, like the Dunkin' Donut commercial where, what was that, back in the 80s or something like that, where the guy wakes up, he goes out and makes donuts, gets up, makes donuts, comes home, makes donuts, it just kind of goes on and on and on, right? And so sometimes life feels that way, but eventually what happens? We do our thing here on this earth, maybe 70, maybe 80, maybe 90 years, if we're fortunate, and then what happens? Well, I think that's what the writer is trying to address. And so it's interesting that when you look at Ecclesiastes, you can double fact check me on this, but I did read that the name Yahweh, the covenant name of God, is not used once in the book. There's very little reference to the Torah. It's kind of referred to generally, like he says things like fear God or keep his commandments. But he doesn't refer to any actual specific laws. And so there's some people that think that this is written to kind of be, for that day, evangelistic. This was something that could be read by anybody, anywhere, and it would get their attention. It would get them thinking. And it's almost as if he's saying, look, the nature that you see around you has more consistency and is more stable than you are. You're just this puny human being that's here and then you're gone. And so there's this guy named, I guess you pronounce it Blaise Pascal. Anybody know who he is? Maybe you recognize him from, what was it, Pascal's Wager? What's Pascal's Rager? Oh, not Rager, Wager. He's not a partier. What's Pascal's Wager? Anybody know what that is? Joel? Classical school? I think he's got it. You got it? I think you do. What is it? Oh, come on. You don't know? All right.
It's like it's more logical to believe in God than to not.
Yeah.
It's better to. It's like placing your bets on going to heaven rather than going to hell if you don't believe something like that.
Yeah, no, that's basically it. He was a mathematician who ended up coming to Christ, and he said, look, if the odds are even, that either God exists or that God doesn't exist, he's saying, which odds should you go all in on? Which one? You should go all in on, okay, I'm going to believe in God, because if there is a God, does that have a payoff? Yeah. If there isn't a God, and I believe that there's a God, how much is that going to hurt me? Not very much. Maybe I didn't do the fleshly things that I wanted to do, but I'm not going to be, regretting it when I'm in the grave and I'm dead, right? On the other hand, the point of the wager is saying that if there is a God and you believe that there isn't a God, is that going to be a problem? Yeah. You're going to wake up and you're going to find that wasn't the case, and you're going to wish that you had chosen differently. But he, I think, kind of strikes a similar chord that the writer of Ecclesiastes is hitting on in this first chapter. He writes about man, and it's kind of poetic how it reads, but he says, I know not who sent me into the world, nor what the world is, nor what I myself am. I'm terribly ignorant of everything. I know not what my body is, nor my senses, nor my soul, and that part of me which thinks what I say, which reflects upon itself as well as upon all external things, and has no more knowledge of itself than of them. I see the terrifying immensity of the universe which surrounds me. Isn't that kind of what Solomon's doing here in chapter 1? Looking around at the universe, looking at the sun. He says, and find myself limited to one corner of this vast expanse, without knowing what I am set down here, why I am set down here, rather than elsewhere, nor why the brief period appointed for my life is assigned to me at this moment rather than another in all eternity that has gone before and will come after me. On all sides I behold nothing but infinity, in which I am a mere atom, a mere passing shadow that returns no more. All I know is that I must soon die, but what I understand least of all is this very death which I cannot escape. And I know not whence I come, so I know not whither I go. I only know that on leaving this world, I fall forever into nothingness or into the hands of the wrathful God. Without knowing to which of these two states I shall be everlastingly consigned, such is my condition, full of weakness and uncertainty. From all this I conclude that I ought to spend every day of my life without seeking to know my fate. I might perhaps be able to find a solution to my doubts, but I cannot be bothered to do so. I will not take one step towards its discovery. Are there a lot of people that live like that? That they kind of, maybe for a minute, think about that dilemma? Okay, what if there is a God? I think we would be blown away how many people who claim to be atheists have that thought pop into their mind. Okay, but what if I'm wrong? And then what do? They get distracted with something else and they go about the rest of their life not thinking twice about it again. And what his point is in saying this is that's really foolish. When it's either nothingness or the hands of a wrathful God. This is something that we should consider and we should give thought to. And so, I think that the writer of Ecclesiastes is kind of trying to get us to see just how small we are in this universe. And so let's just finish that little section there. He says in verse 9, what has been is what will be. What has been done is what will be done. There's nothing new under the sun. Can one say about anything, look, this is new. It's already existed in the ages before us. There's no remembrance of those who came before. And of those who will come after, there also will be no remembrance by those who follow them. And so his point is, I think that he's saying is that it seems like everything we look at nature is more constant than we are, and yet weren't we made a little lower than the angels? And yet, on top of this kind of transient nature of man, this fact that we're just here temporarily, we really contribute very little when it comes to being remembered. There's some people that say, well, I'm at least going to do something great with my life. Well, I think the typical person I once read is forgotten about like within 2 generations, something like that. Like, the only people that are going to remember us most likely are going to be our grandkids. And then after that, maybe they'll hear stories, but they're not going to remember us. They're not going to have much of a personal experience with us. And so that's what we're looking at. You know what? 80 years. Nobody will really care about our accomplishments. I think that's what he's pointing to. And so, again, the question is that he started out with was, what does a person gain for all his efforts that he labors under the sun? It's like, why not just end it down? But I think that we're going to find that there's a positive, that Ecclesiastes is a more positive book than what it's given credit. You notice in your handout that I gave you, this isn't behind me, but the book of Ecclesiastes was often associated with joy. In fact, it was read the 3rd day during the Feast of Booths, which was a joyous celebration, so much so that they were actually commanded to rejoice. When you go back and read Nehemiah, you'll find that they were told specifically not to mix, mourning with rejoicing, that they were to have joy during that week. And so they would read Ecclesiastes. If they saw Ecclesiastes as being depressing, being a downer, do you think they'd read it during the Feast of Booths? That seems kind of counterintuitive. And then you look at the word joy, and it pops up 17 times in the book of Ecclesiastes. And so I think that what we're wrestling with is maybe, how can I have joy? How can I have joy when it seems like I'm just such a blip on the radar, when it seems like life is changing so much? And isn't that a relevant question for all of us? How many of us struggle with nostalgia from time to time, longing for the past? A couple weeks ago, we flew and connected into Seattle, and I've seen Seattle at night numerous times. But there's something different about flying into it since I moved away. That was home. But even if I move back there, they say, you can never go home again. Once you leave home, you can never go back, right? That's true. It's different. It's not the place I grew up with. I find myself longing for that childhood that I had. I think that we all struggle with that, and we can get caught up with that to the extent that it steals our joy. And we get so depressed about the ever-changing nature of life. And so it says, who is Kuheleth? And all that Kuheleth means, and the reason I use it there, is because if you read a commentary, you might find that they use this word, Kuheleth, Kuheleth, Kuheleth. That's just the Hebrew translation that's used in reference to the narrator or writer of the book, right? So that means, basically what it means actually is a convener, or an assembler, and therefore a preacher, right? So that's literally what this word means. It's somebody that gathers people together and is going to talk to them. He's going to tell them something. And so literally a convener, an assembler, a preacher. And so what do we know about this guy? We know that he identifies himself, or at least those words, as he's the son of David, king in Jerusalem. And so in Ecclesiastes 1 verse 12, he goes even more specific, and he says, I've been king over Israel and Jerusalem. How many kings can you think of that are the son of David, that reigned in Jerusalem, and were not just king over Jerusalem, but actually were a king over all of Israel? How many kings fit that bill? It's less than you think. What did you say? 1? Yeah. I mean, you got David, right? And then you have, sorry, what? Yeah, David and Solomon. That's pretty much it. And so, long story short, Solomon is at least, the writer is at least claiming to be Solomon. Solomon is most likely Kuheleth. And there's some people that have kind of kicked back on that. Because what do we read about Solomon? It's interesting. I was talking to a little boy this last week, and they were talking about Solomon. I was asking him, what did you learn in Bible class? and his mom and him were going back and forth about Solomon. His mom was saying Solomon is the most wise king that, in all of Israel's history. And then the little boy was saying, well, no, he's not. And he was frustrated. He was saying he was not wise. And he was very adamant about it. Who's right in that conversation? The boy or the mom? Yes, right? Because Solomon had all this wisdom, and yet what's the last thing we read about him in the Kings and Chronicles accounts? What's the last thing we know about him? They turned away, right? That's the last thing that's mentioned. It actually says the Lord was angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice, and had commanded him concerning this. Basically, he disobeys God because he's idolatrous, right? And he has many wives, and they turn his heart away, and you weren't supposed to have foreign wives, and he ends up doing all these things that God told him not to do. But with that in mind, can somebody read 2 Chronicles 11 and verse 17? Somebody want to volunteer to read that? Okay, go ahead.
They strengthened the kingdom of Judah, supported Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, for 2 years. They walked in the way of David and Solomon for 2 years.
Right, so there's a context there. We don't need to get caught up in the context. But basically, there's a group of people being commended, and what's kind of the standard that they're being commended for following? Whose standard? David and Solomon. So that's interesting. If Solomon was just this wicked king that blew it, it's kind of interesting to me that you commend somebody for walking in the ways of David and Solomon. We know David also blew it, right? But that's another story. Who wants to read? This is different. This isn't Solomon, but this is an example here that I want to look at. So let's look at 2 Kings 21, verses 17 through 18. That's about King Manasseh. So how wicked was King Manasseh before we read that? Said that he filled the streets, the streets of Jerusalem end to end with blood, right? I mean, he was just as wicked can be. Did horrible things, and yeah, he's basically sets the bar for wickedness. And so read 2 Kings 21, verses 17 through 18. Whoever's got it, yeah.
Now the rest of the acts of Manasseh, all that he did, and the sin that he committed, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah? So Manasseh rested with his fathers and was buried in the garden of his own house, in the garden of Uzzah, and his son Amon reigned in his place.
All right, so knowing what we know about Manasseh, is there any reason to think, that this was a guy that ended on a high note at all from that text? No. But let's read 2 Chronicles 33 and verse 19. Somebody read that for me. 2 Chronicles 33 and verse 19. Go ahead.
His prayer also, and how God was entreated by him, and all his sins, his unfaithfulness, and the side on which he built high places and erected the Asherah and the carved images, before he humbled himself, before they were written in the records of Hosea.
All right, so that's not mentioning kings. What is it that Manasseh is said to have done? They're just kind of in a passing comment, really. What is it that he did? He humbled himself. And it says that God, I think some versions say, heard his prayer. You don't have that in the King's account. There's other people like this in the Bible where if you just look at one account, you don't have the full story. Can you guys think of anybody else that's that way? Dan actually taught a class during the men's study on one particular person that I'm thinking of. Dan's like, I don't remember. How about the thief on the cross? Do all versions say, today you'll be with me in paradise? No, the other versions don't mention that. They say that there's two thieves that were reviling Jesus. And if you don't have all the accounts, you don't get that part. I think there's some people that when they get to heaven, I actually heard a preacher talking about this last Sunday, they're going to be surprised if they only read that one account. Well, maybe not now because they have the whole Bible. But in those days, if they just got one of those Gospels and two thieves, reviling Jesus, They're going to be surprised, and they're going to say, what are you doing here? And they don't have the rest of that story. And so I think when it comes to Solomon, again, I'm just kind of putting this before you. It doesn't have to be absolutely set in stone. Just because we don't have an account of him having like this revelation where he turns back to God doesn't mean that that didn't take place. I think that if Ecclesiastes was written by Solomon, it had to have been written, in my mind, it had to have been written after he kind of fell away. And it's interesting, when you do read the king's account, it talks about how God like afflicted Solomon. He told him that he's going to take his kingdom away, that he's going to divide it. And he's going to do it not in his lifetime, but in the lifetime of his son. That's exactly what happens. But why would God afflict Solomon that way? Just to put him through the ringer? Why would he do that? Maybe he'll respond. And so maybe Ecclesiastes is the account of what happened near the tail end of Solomon's life, for what it's worth. If it is, what you have in Solomon is really the most qualified man. I almost think that Ecclesiastes demands a character like Solomon. When we're talking about all things under the sun, what character other than Jesus in the Bible is more qualified to talk about all things under the sun than Solomon? What are the things that gave Solomon an advantage when it came to understanding life and the world and how things operate? What are some things that he had going for him that aided him in his pursuit of wisdom and knowledge?
First, God blessed him.
Yep.
Some degree of wisdom, but he had all the power, all the money, all the resources, all the time that he needed to do all the things he wanted to do.
Yep. He also had marriage alliances. I mean, he marries Pharaoh's daughter. That's going to give you some insight into how one of the most powerful nations to ever have existed operates, and probably the height of evil that exists as well. I mean, who knows what kind of insights he's getting into the world just through all these marriage alliances that he had. He had the best trade routes in the world, and so you got people constantly coming and going, and all the wisdom that might have offered. And then, like Steve just said, he's one of the richest kings that ever lived. Had tons of money, had all the resources in the world to study and learn as much as possible about the world and how it worked. And so he's described as being blessed by God. He says, I'm going to give you a wise and discerning mind so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall rise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. So he had every resource available. And I always found this verse interesting in 1 Kings 4 and verse 33 through 34, kind of giving a summation of Solomon's greatness. It says, he spoke of trees from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish, and people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom. So this isn't just a guy that's talking about life, but he's like almost into like biology and things like that, and the animals and the trees and just how everything works. And I think he fits the bill in this text of being the assembler, being a convener, because what is the whole nation doing when they hear about Solomon's wisdom? They're convening. They're coming from all nations to hear what this guy has to say. And we have one example of that, and who? Queen of Sheba, right? Came from thousands of miles to come and hear what this guy had to say. And so I think he had a unique reach, and I think that this letter, not a letter, I guess it's poetry, this book of Ecclesiastes that we read would have had special relevance for everybody. And so when we get to the second section, let's read 12 through 18, and we can wrap up. I think this is his credentials. He's saying, this is why I'm qualified to speak on these matters. I'm not a guy that's just read a bunch of books. I'm a guy that's qualified to talk about this. He says, I, the teacher, have been king over Israel and Jerusalem. I applied my mind to examine and explore through wisdom all that's done under heaven. God has given people this miserable task to keep them occupied. I've seen all things that are done under the sun and have found everything to be futile, a pursuit of the wind. There's that word again. Is it futile? Is it vain? Or is it a vapor? Is it a mist? I'm just struggling to grasp it. And there's this proverb in verse 15. What is crooked cannot be straightened. What is lacking cannot be counted. I then you're supposed to look at that proverb in verse 15 as kind of a summarization of what he said in verses 12 through, well, really 13 and 14, where you have Solomon who says, I was seeking and I was searching. The word search literally means to spy out, like a reconnaissance mission. You're looking at things from all angles is really what that word means. This is a guy that was pouring himself into understanding everything that he could, and what did he find? It's an unhappy business. And as a summary, he gives this proverb, I think, in verse 15. He says, what is crooked cannot be made straight. What is lacking cannot be counted. What does that mean, you think? He talks about his pursuit of wisdom, and this is one conclusion that he reached. What does that mean? What does it mean when it says what is crooked cannot be made straight and what is lacking cannot be counted?
Off the top of my head, it sounds like nothing works. There's so many things wrong you couldn't even know.
Yeah. It's almost like he's saying, okay, I've pursued the wisdom, that's one thing, but all I've done is identified a bunch of problems. I'm not able to straighten what is crooked. I'm not even able to count what is lacking. I think that's kind of one idea that's being thrown out there. And then he kind of makes a similar statement. I think both these sections are similar here, where he talks about his pursuit of wisdom again. He said, I said in my heart, in verse 16, I've acquired great wisdom, surpassing all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my heart has had a great experience of wisdom and knowledge. And I applied my heart to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. So he's saying, I tried not just only to understand wisdom, but I thought, okay, maybe I'll look at the foolish people of the world and maybe I can learn something that way. Maybe the opposites will explain each other. So I looked at wisdom. I looked at foolishness. I looked at madness. He says, I perceive that this also is but striving after the wind. For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So the more we try to know about the world, well, let me put it another way. Who are the happiest people in the world? Who are the happiest people in the world? Jesus tells us to be like them. We're children, right? And how much do children know about how the world works? Very little. And yet, they're very happy. Can you imagine being king? And knowing not just the ins and outs and the problems of your own nation, but knowing what's going on in other nations. Do you think that's something that would make you happier? Or do you think it's something that would be vexing, that would be sorrowful? He says, he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. And so this is the first section of Ecclesiastes, and this first section ends on a low note. But we're going to see there's a way to get wisdom, to get knowledge, in a way where we also receive joy. And we'll talk about that next week, but maybe we'll end on this note. The way that Solomon talks about wisdom here, is it different than how wisdom is talked about in other passages in the Bible? I mean, here it's almost like, man, you don't want anything to do with wisdom. But then what about how wisdom is talked about in Proverbs? How is it talked about there? Yeah, get it is what it says. It literally says, get wisdom, right? So what's going on here? Is he contradicting what he writes in Proverbs? I mean, theoretically, it's the same people writing it. Or is there something more going on here?
There's two different kinds of wisdom. There's wisdom that we know here on earth that doesn't really need. Then there's God's wisdom that we need.
There's a way to pursue wisdom in which God moves to the background and wisdom moves to the foreground. It's all about knowing, understanding. If that's what we're doing, we're going to find that we'll have no joy. We'll just be perplexed. We'll find meaninglessness. We'll wonder what all this is about. We wonder, what is exactly in it for me? But there's also a way to, again, pursue wisdom in a way that leads to joy. And so in Proverbs, the beginning of wisdom is what? What's the beginning of wisdom? Fear God. That's right. That's the beginning of wisdom. And we'll also see that theme in the book of Ecclesiastes. And so I think that this is a contemplative chapter and should cause us always to be thinking about our place in the universe and not getting too wrapped up in what this world has to offer, but thinking, okay, is there something above the sun? I see what's going on under, but is there something above and beyond the sun? Anybody have any comments or questions? Thoughts? No. All right, thank you for your time.